Hi guys, welcome to this video. It's been a long one in the making. It's been a while since I actually posted a tutorial, but this is essentially going to be the part 2 that many of you guys have been waiting for. Essentially the follow-up to the facial morph tutorial that I did a while ago for 3ds Max, in which I went over how to use ZBrush to create morph targets, and then use Reaction Manager in conjunction with spline controls to control your character's facial expressions. In that video, I essentially alluded to how you can do something similar with just bones, and I also promised to make essentially a rigging tutorial where we go over how to set up a basic cat system for an entire character. And we could essentially kill two birds with one stone and combine that with some facial bone stuff. So, without further ado, that's what we're going to be doing today. So here is Ludo. You may have seen me stream working on this character, and he's currently in ZBrush. I went through the multi-map exporter process and essentially shot out all of the maps and OBJs. So let me open up 3ds Max. Alright. So here is that mesh into 3ds Max and pretty much how it imported. So you can see there's some definite issues there. Character is below the grid. He's also way too small. So we're going to have to do some scaling and tweaking. I also want to point out that all these meshes are currently separate. Why? Well, that's one of the cool things about working with Cat, is that pretty much like most current workflows, you can keep everything separate until you're completely happy with how it comes out and combine stuff afterwards. So what I'm going to be doing as I set up my rig for this character is that I'll be rigging pieces that need more control, for example the face, the ears, and areas that don't need control, such as the horns and the eyeballs, etc. I'm going to rig those separately and then combine everything after I'm done and I'm happy with the way that everything deforms once I do my initial skinning. And we can easily do so using something called skin wrap, but I'll save that for essentially the very end of this tutorial. So the first step is going to be to essentially scale this guy up and make sure that it's pivots for everything pretty much except for the eyeballs, because we're going to use a LookAt constraint for that. But basically the pivots for everything need to be not just centered to the character sort of origin, but also to world space. It's very important that your character is centered in coordinates 0, 0, 0 before you start doing any rigging. So the easiest thing to do, I find, is to just select all your meshes, hit F, which will take you to the orthographic front viewport, and I'm just going to move this character up so that its feet are essentially on top of the grid line right here. Okay, maybe a little bit more, something like that. Good. At this point, I can open up my pivot manager and I can start tweaking the pivot. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on Effect Pivot Only, which will allow us to essentially move the pivot to wherever we want. And because I have all of these objects selected, I'm affecting all of the pivots at once. So what I want to do is essentially set, at the very least, the Z value to 0. That'll snap it to the ground. I'll do the same thing for Y. And now in side view, I'm going to just move this back so that the pivot lives between the character's feet. Basically, the center of mass for this character. It's very important that you do this before rigging. You want to make sure that the pivot is in the correct spot. At this point, you can turn off Effect Pivot Only. And we're actually going to have to move this character to the origin now. So the pivot's in the correct spot, but the character is not. So I'm going to make sure all of these coordinate values are set to 0. and now my character is perfectly centered in the world. Great time to save, and when you're rigging, you want to make sure you save often, by the way. The next thing I want to go ahead and do is make sure my character is the correct size. So what I like to do is, first off, I want to make sure that my units are set up correctly. So if you go to Customize, Unit Setup, you want to make sure you do this probably before you import your character, because I've seen issues where if you imported your character and then change the units in a scene, it can mess up. But typically I use metrics, so meters, for my max units. So this makes it pretty easy to figure out how big this character needs to be. Apologies, by the way, if I sound sick. I am. I just came back from PAX East, and I definitely contracted something terrible. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a box and create it. And I'm going to set the height of that to be 2 meters, because that's roughly how tall this character needs to be. So now I can select this character's pieces, switch to scale mode, and you want to make sure that you scale from essentially the world axes. So the bottom scale functionality is what you want to use to scale up your character. So now we can go ahead and scale everything up until he is the correct height. So something like that. And we don't need this reference object anymore, so we can go ahead and delete that. But something you need to be aware of when you scale characters or any geometry inside of 3ds Max, you won't see it in the viewport necessarily, but you will when you render, is that your normals are essentially completely out of whack. So your normal map will all of a sudden look terrible. It'll look like there is like a lot of artifacts in there. The whole thing just won't look right. And the reason that happens is because we scaled this object. Scaling is a pretty destructive operation inside of a 3D package. We want to make sure that we essentially wipe that history from this object. And the way to do so is by selecting all these meshes, going to your control panel over here, and looking for the Reset Xform button. Definitely save before doing this, because it has the tendency to crash. So I'm going to hit Reset Xform and then Reset Selected. And what you didn't see happen, but it did happen behind the scenes, is if you click on these individually, you'll see that in the modifier stack, there's now an Xform modifier on top of all of these objects. So what I'm going to do is select all of these objects again and just bake that Xform in by right-clicking and converting it to an editable poly. Perfect. So at this point, all of the pivots are pretty much in the correct spot, with the exception of our eyeballs. So I'm just going to select the eyeball object. You'll see that they're actually combined into one editable poly. So I'm going to have to go into the element selection mode and detach one of them. So click detach. Great time to name. So I'll call this I, L. And then that'll make the one that I have selected I, right. Cool. So now I can select both eyes, open up my pivot manager, hit effect pivot only, and then click on center to object. I can then disable effect pivot only, and essentially at this point in time, the eyeballs, if I switch to individual pivots for rotation, should already pretty much behave or be ready for a LookAt controller in terms of functioning like actual eyeballs. Great. Again, this is maybe not a conventional way of rigging because we're keeping so many things separate, but it gives us a great deal of freedom. So at this point in time, I like to look at my character and kind of look at objects that I know that I'm going to be linking to bones, as well as objects that are going to be skinned. So obviously stuff that is soft tissue, like the head, the arms, probably even the nails, and the tail, are going to be linked, or actually skinned to the bones that we're going to be creating. Same thing probably for, at the very least, the tongue. Other objects that aren't necessarily going to deform organically, like the eyeballs and the horns, and probably the teeth, are not going to be skinned in this particular tutorial. I'm actually just going to simply link them to the bones in question. You could skin them, but I'm just being lazy, and I'm choosing not to. But you know, if you use the techniques that I'm going to be outlining in this video, you'll pretty much understand how to do so anyways. But I'm just choosing not to because I think it's easier to just link them in this particular case. If you're exporting this from Max, however, you do probably want to skin them. So I'm just going to select these objects that I know are not going to be deforming necessarily, and I want to separate those out as well. So the horns are already their own object, eyeballs are as well. The teeth I'm going to separate into upper and lower teeth, because I'm going to link one to the head bone, the upper teeth, and the lower teeth are going to be linked to the jawbone. So I'm going to select those lower teeth, and I'll detach, and I'll call them lower teeth, and that will make the teeth that I currently have selected the upper teeth. And I'll do the same thing for the gums, because realistically there's probably not going to be much motion there. It's just bone with a very thin layer of skin on top of it. So I'll detach the upper gums, I'll detach the lower gums, and I'll leave the tongue because I am going to add a bone to the tongue in question here, so we can animate that separately. So now we should pretty much have everything set up. So we have a separate tongue, separate upper gums, separate lower gums, separate lower teeth, and separate upper teeth, as well as horns and eyeballs. Okie dokie. So I'm going to end isolate, and it's nice to stay organized as you're working. So what I like to do is put everything that is a mesh on one layer. So I'm going to open up my Layer Explorer, which is already here. Let me just maximize that. And in here we can create new layers, as well as kind of toggle between different modes of display. So right now I have the default layer selected. I'm going to select all of these meshes, and I'm going to hit create new layer. With those selected, it will automatically place them in that corresponding layer. And if you hold down your left mouse button and you click on the layer name, you can just rename this to whatever you'd like. So I'll call this mesh. I'm going to make sure I don't select everything, and I'm going to make a new layer that I'll call cat objects. So this is the layer that we're going to be placing the bones on top of, or in I should say, and we can toggle between these layers by just clicking on this layer icon. I'm going to just select my character's body, and I am going to attach these nails. So I'll attach nails, and this is now one editable poly. Great. Cool. So I'm going to go back to my layer manager, make sure I select the cat objects layer, and at this point in time I'm going to make my meshes semi-transparent, and I'm going to freeze them because I'm going to start creating the actual cat rig. So I don't want to make any boo-boos and accidentally move meshes around. I just want to have them there for reference. So you can make these transparent by hitting Alt and X, and then right-clicking, freeze selection. So now we have this object here. It's kind of partially transparent, and that will allow us to have a more clean way of working. So we can add cat bones and objects without worrying that we're messing up this mesh. Alright, so the cat object can be found in the Helper tab. So if you go to Create, Helpers, there should be a drop-down menu called Cat Objects. Fairly simple menu. The one you're looking for is called Cat Parent. So if I select that, I can just drag this Cat Parent object onto our grid, and just like our character mesh, you want to make sure it's centered. So after I drag this out, you want to right-click to commit, and then you can just zero out these coordinates to make sure it's completely centered. Alright. So we have an object name, I like to call this cat underscore Ludo. Okay. And I can do the same thing over here, cat underscore, or cat Ludo maybe. And the way cat works is fairly simple. Let me actually isolate this so you can kind of see why cat is such a versatile system. So the basic premise is that you start off by creating a pelvis, which will place this box, and this box is a bone, and we'll talk about this in more detail as I actually set up the rig. And you can add structures to this. So there's two kind of objects inside of cat. There's a hub, which your hips are one, the pelvis is one, and then there's regular bones that have sort of predefined rigging on there. So a good example is the leg. If I add the leg, you'll see it'll place this object, which has a foot controller with IK set up, and then it has this upper and lower leg bone, which we can essentially place wherever we'd like through just transform operations. It'll kind of adjust and scale things. And if we're happy, if you go back to the hub that you spawned one of these from and click on the same button, so if we want to add another leg, it's kind of smart about it, and it'll add a duplicate copy. Okay, so let me just undo this, start a fresh cat rig so we can make sure that we're on the same page. So same thing, draw the cat parent out, zero out those values, name it, and go to the modify panel to change it further. Okay, so let's start off by creating the pelvis. So what you need to keep in mind as you set up bones for your character using cat is that the only thing that really matters here is the place of the pivot point. That pivot point is essentially going to determine how this bone is going to behave and where it's going to rotate and move from. The shape of it does not matter so much. The bigger you make these boxes, the better your initial skinning will be, but that really is about it. It's not going to really do anything else. So you want to make sure that you just take a critical look at these pivot points as you place these objects, and I'll give you guys some pointers as I'm walking through, things I usually look out for, but it's really fairly simple as long as you stick to these pointers. So let's take a look at this pelvis. I want to make sure I place the pivot sort of in the center of mass of my character, and he has a pretty slanted pelvis. So first off, I'm going to make sure it's centered to my character's body. I'll take a little bit of guessing and looking for multiple different angles. And then once I'm happy with the overall positioning of it, I can switch to rotation to kind of match the angle of the pelvis I have going here. You want to make sure that you work with local transforms and local rotations, so definitely change these to reflect. So I'll just give the pelvis a little bit of an angle so it matches the direction it's kind of following in the mesh. And then in the modify panel, unlike the biped, you do not want to use scale to scale your bones here. You do want to stick to these parameters. Okay, definitely name this hub to something that makes sense. So call it pelvis. You can leave the name up here. And I'm just going to give it a little bit more height. Maybe something like that. A little bit more depth. And slightly more width. Great. And at this point I'm ready to add my leg. So I'm going to click on add leg. Cat will place down the first leg object. So when you're working with extremities in cat, it's always important that you work with the outermost part first. And the leg is a little bit different because it has a platform. You do not want to move the bones inside of the leg before you essentially place this platform. This platform is going to essentially determine where our foot bone is going to sit, and you do not want to move this foot bone off the platform. The foot bone essentially needs to be where the platform is in order for it to be animated properly. So I'll grab the foot platform and I'll just move that, maybe give it a little bit of rotation so it kind of matches the angle of the foot, not too much, something like this. And this is probably the trickiest part when working with CAT, is kind of figuring out where the ankle joint's going to sit. So what I like to do is after I place the foot bone, or the foot platform I should say, in the correct spot, I'll mess around with the length of the foot bone, actually, yeah, length, and we want to pay careful attention to this pivot. This pivot here should sit essentially where your ankle is going to be rotating. So maybe a little lower, something like that. And then we can tweak it by just moving the platform, not the foot bone, the platform along the appropriate axis. It might be easier to just set your wireframe to white for this, by the way. You can just change that in the Object Properties window. Makes it easier to kind of see where these bones are located. Good. Next thing I want to do is add a toe. So I can click on the foot and I can add digits. So if I go to the Modify panel, I can add various digits. I'm just going to make one simplified toe for toe roll purposes. So I'll add number of digits 1, and you'll see that in here it actually created a bunch of bones for me to work with. 2, in fact, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. And we don't really need 2. We need 1. So I'm going to select the first bone in that chain, digit 1, and I'll call it, or I'll change the number of bones to 1, and I'll call this toe right. And this bone we can just move. So even though we can move it freely, it's still parented to the foot bone itself. And this will allow us to freely place it wherever the rotation would make sense. And again, this is where that pivot point is important. So kind of figure out where the center of rotation is going to be for all 3 of these toes, and rotate and move as necessary. So I'm probably going to choose kind of the center of the middle toe here as the center point of rotation, and make sure it's aligned properly. And I'll probably go ahead and make it a little wider and a little longer, just so I have an easier time selecting it. It's a little too long there. So something like that. A little taller too. And again, pay careful attention to just the pivot point here. Great time to save. So now I can worry about the placement of the lower leg. So make sure again that you're using local transform. You're not really rotating any of these bones in the leg except for the foot platform. You should just have to use the move tool. So I'm just going to place this lower leg bone and kind of think about how the knee behaves. So obviously anatomically the kneecap itself kind of rolls between your upper and lower leg, but for simplification purposes, if you had to have it favor either your upper or lower leg bone, always have it favor the lower leg bone. It looks really weird if your knee cap stays in place with the upper leg as your lower leg rotates. So make sure that you place the pivot in an area where it would make sense. Again, we're not really super committed here because a lot of this can be controlled through skinning, but the better a job you do initially, the less cleanup work we'll have to do. So let's maybe move this in slightly so it's a little bit straighter chain-wise. I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, great. So now I can worry about the hip placement. So a lot of leg rig issues come from not properly placing sort of the hip socket And CAT's really versatile and easy to use, so there's no excuses to not have this in the proper spot. So this character's hips, the socket is definitely deeper inside the body than most people place this. Like, most errors occur when people place the hip socket way out there. But just like with your shoulder socket, that rotation is happening inside of the body quite a bit, deeper than most people give it credit for. So let's make sure that that pivot sits in the correct spot. Again, it's a little tough to see, but the more you do this, the better you get at it. But I'm pretty happy with the way that looks. Okay, so that looks fairly good to me, and I'm pretty happy with the way that came out. So great time to save. Now, what I usually do is, because the way that the legs and arms, in fact, rotate is fairly complex, there's less rotation on the, in this case, x-axis happening at the top of the hip than there is at the bottom of the leg. I like to add twist bones, just like you would see in the forearm, right? So there's less rotation on the x-axis at the elbow level than there is at the wrist. Sorry, I'm getting all snotty. So we want to make sure that we can include that in the actual rigging by adding twist bones. And the quickest way to do that is to just break these bones, the upper and the lower leg bone, up into 2 bones each. So I'm going to select the upper leg and change the number of segments in the Modify panel to 2. Okay, so now it's 2 separate bones. I'm going to do the same thing for the lower leg. Right, so my entire leg essentially consists of 4 bones plus whatever's in the foot. Great time to save. Alright, so maybe I'll just go in here and make the foot platform a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to change the length so it's more easily grabbable. We can swap any of these controllers out with custom shapes later. Maybe I'll make a separate video out of this. But yeah, it's easier to just grab if it's a little bit bigger than the actual standard size. So at this point I can click on the pelvis and click on Add Leg again so that it mirrors it over to the other anatomical side. So both of my legs are currently set up. Cool thing about CAT is that if I move the hips, you'll see that because of the IK-FK setup, it will correspond and behave like you would expect. So it's actually already a fairly complex rig without us really having done major work. Like, a lot of stuff is being taken care for us behind the scenes. Alright, so the next thing I want to add is a tail. So again, keep in mind that when you're working with CAT, whenever you're dealing with a hub, right, so this is a hub, the pelvis, we can add more complex bones. If you're adding a more rigging to an existing bone, you're probably just going to be limited to adding regular bones, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's nice to work with these prefabs for as much as you can. So I'm going to click on Add Tail, and you'll see it puts it in the completely wrong spot, right? But it's fairly easy to move these around. So whenever you're moving CAT objects, you want to make sure you click on the first bone in the chain, or double click on it, I should say, so that you select the entire chain. That allows you to move it. Why do you have to do it that way? Well, if you just click on one bone and move it, you're essentially transforming it or changing the way it is shaped. So after you move it to the correct spot, you can just select the first one in a chain and then rotate to however you see fit. So maybe I just need 1, 2, 3, 4 bones in this chain. So I'll change the number of links to 4. Okay, and at this point we can just place these guys in a way that makes sense. So again, be very conscious and aware about where you're placing this pivot. So the tail is going to have sort of a start rotation at this point. Maybe the next bone starts over here. Make sure it's centered to the mesh and that it's following the topology nicely. And then maybe that bone sits over there, and maybe this last bone sits over here-ish. And we'll give it a little bit of rotation so it follows the general path of the tail geometry a little bit better. Right, so they're fairly evenly spaced. I don't expect to need a lot of control in this tail, so I think that's more than fine for some basic motion. So I'm pretty happy with that. Great time to save. Alright, so now we can talk about the spine. Now, opinions are fairly divided about this, but I honestly think that when you're rigging, fewer bones usually gets the job done better, more efficiently. You can do a lot of stuff with skinning, and oftentimes it gives you much more realistic deformation. So a lot of people, for cartoony characters especially, will add a bunch of spine joints, but I'm a fan of just simplifying things. So I'm going to select the hip, and I'm going to click on Add Spine, and you'll see it kind of creates this chain with a hub at the top, which we're not essentially going to be skinning the character to. This is basically a control object, and these are your spine bones. Now, this is way too many. Typically, when I do a spine, I do 2 joints. So I'll select the bottom joint here, and I'll change the number of bones to 2. So that will leave you with 2 spine joints and the top hub. Okay, and I'm going to start off by placing this bottom joint essentially where this character's belly is, right? So that's kind of inside of the pelvic area still. And I'll make this a little bit wider, so it kind of encompasses the majority of the geometry of the torso, and a little bit deeper as well. And again, be very aware of where you're placing this pivot. So I'll just move that so it's a little bit more centered. And now we can move the hub in the correct spot. The hub is basically going to kind of, in this case, I guess, live at the very top of the torso. Same thing is true for humanoid characters. You basically want it sitting in an area where it's easily grabbable. This is probably one of those objects you want to replace when you're doing a custom rig with maybe like some nice arrows or a big circle. But that is basically just there for control purposes. You really do not need to be skinning that. So the second bone in the spine is essentially going to be the torso, right? So the actual rib cage. And I can move the pivot point of that down to where I believe it should be sitting. If I look at my character's geometry, I would probably imagine like the rib cage to kind of be right around there. So I'll place the pivot in that spot, and maybe I'll move the stomach down just a smidge. So something like that. And then I can make this a little bit wider, so it's the actual width of the torso, and a little bit deeper, so it's the actual depth of the torso. And maybe I'll just move this down slightly. Something like that. Okay, so we have our spine set up. Really simple, 2 bones, upper one for the torso, middle one for the belly, and this is our control hub. Again, great time to save. Save often, preferably in iterations. So at this point we're pretty much ready to add the arm. And it's, again, very similar to the foot. Want to make sure we work from the outer extremities inwards. So I'm going to select this upper hub, and I'm going to click on Add Arm. And you'll see it places a clavicle, an upper arm, and a palm inside of our scene. So the first thing you want to do is place this palm in the correct spot. And again, you want to make sure you use local transformations for this. So I'm just going to move that pivot point in the correct spot, down a little bit lower, centered to the hand. And then I'll just go ahead and rotate this so it kind of matches the overall direction of the model's palm. So something like that. A little bit more up. And you really want to make sure you spend your time looking at these pivots, right? So a lot of people tend to place the wrist pivot way too high. Like they'll actually move it up here, but that's really not where your wrist bends. Probably a little bit higher than what I have it now, but that's probably about as high as I would go. Okay, so I'll just add a little bit of length and width to this palm so that it kind of sticks out of the hand nicely. Looks pretty good. Nice. So now I can place the elbow. So same thing, using local transforms, place this elbow so it sits in the correct spot. And the same thing applies to the elbow as does to the knee. So your elbow bone should favor your forearm when your arm is rotating. Don't have it so that it's mostly controlled by your upper arm bone. That is where things will start to look really wonky. So if anything, the pivot point for the forearm should probably go up a little bit higher and further back in relation to the front of the arm than you would normally place it. So that looks pretty good to me. Make sure it's centered from all views. So I'm pretty happy with that. And then same thing is true for the arm socket as the hip socket. People do not place this deep enough. People rely on the clavicle joint to kind of control the way the shoulder works. And you really don't need to. The clavicle really is mostly for the clavicle area. Your shoulders should be driven mostly by your upper arm bone. So place it where the actual socket would be, right? So your socket is fairly deep inside of your body, almost parallel to the rib cage itself. And that's where I'm going to put it. So make sure it's centered from all angles. And really be careful where you place this bone. It will greatly determine how successful the overall transformations will be initially. So that looks pretty good to me. Now I can select the clavicle and actually move that to where the geometry sits. So that was pretty quick. So something like that looks pretty good to me. Right, so we have the clavicle, the upper arm, and the forearm set up nicely. Great time to save. Now we can add some fingers. So the same way that you would add digits to the foot, you would go about doing that for the hand. So select the palm left. Right, make sure I actually named things correctly. I think I may have called this toe right. Yeah, I did. I just remember that. Redemption. Random. So yeah, palm left. And I'm going to click on number of digits. So in this case, 3. If you have a human character, it's obviously going to be 5. So number of digits, 3. And it'll do a terrible job placing them initially, and it'll make them way too short. But it should have the correct number of segments automatically. So 3 for the fingers is good. If it doesn't, you can set it to 3 in the modify panel. But the same thing applies as with the tail. If you want to move these, double click on the first one in a joint chain, move the pivot point to the correct spot. Make sure it's centered from all angles. And once it is, click on the first one and rotate the overall axis of this entire chain to match. Okay. So you want to really make sure you do a good job with this. I'll move this over to the left a little bit more. That looks fairly centered. And I'll just grab the end of this chain, move that down to where I would expect the tip of the finger to curl. All right, so maybe right around here. Let's give it a little bit of extra length. And now I can move that secondary joint. And again, make sure you look at the pivot point and that it matches the overall geometry and direction of the hand. So basically what we're going to end up with is something that looks like this. So I'm pretty quick at it, but you may not be when you're first doing this, so you may be really happy with the way your first finger kind of turned out. Luckily, you can copy bone settings. So if I select the first joint of this finger that I just completed, I can go over to the Modify panel and click Copy Digit Settings. Select on, or select the first bone in a finger chain that I want to copy this to. Let me save it. And then I'm just going to paste digit settings, and we'll copy those settings pretty much identically in terms of orientation over to this particular chain. Makes it a little bit easier to get started. I mean, you're still going to have to like scale and move these guys, but it's much more close to what you have on the other finger, so it should make the setup a little bit quicker. So make sure you check your axes, and we'll rotate this something like that, and I'm going to add a little bit of X rotation there so that when the hand, or when I curl this finger, it'll kind of curl inwards towards the palm. And I think I'm going to move these joints up slightly because that finger is a little bit shorter than the other one. So something like that. And again, make sure they're centered to the finger itself. So maybe in a little. Good. And now we'll do a thumb. So I'll usually start by just rotating this until it follows the general direction of the thumb. You'll notice there's 3 joints there. Is that bad for the thumb? Not at all. The thumb does have 3 joints, except one's really like hidden in the meat of the hand. So first order of business is I like to make sure that essentially the second joint is going to be the base of the thumb that we see, so the first knuckle, if you will. So I'm going to make sure everything lines up as such. And we're going to add a little bit of X rotation here. So I'm just placing these to match the geometry a little bit better. Then I can place that first and secondary joint so it matches the geometry a little bit better. So maybe I'll just rotate this slightly and move it over so it's a little straighter. Something like that. I'll add a little bit of depth to this last bone in the chain so it's easier to grab. I'll move this second joint up a little so it sits more center to that knuckle. And then this very first joint I'm going to place inside of essentially the hand itself. What that will do is that it'll allow me to animate some nice clasping, right? So the hand will actually kind of fold in on itself, particularly this meaty area of the thumb as I rotate these joints inward. So that hand is pretty much set up at this point. Now we're just going to add twist bones. So same thing as we did to the legs. I'm going to split up my forearm into 2 bones. I'm going to split up my upper arm into 2 bones. And that's it. So my arm is now 4 bones. I have my hand and I have my clavicle. Now I can select that hub and click on Add Arm, and it will mirror it over to the other side automatically. So, so far, so good, right? So now we can worry about the head, the ears, and the tongue. And I'm going to add like facial control bones way later after I've already kind of set up the main character components, because it's just easier to do them separately. Okay, so I've reached sort of this top area, and now I need to add the neck and the head. And you'll notice that with this hub selected, which is the neck, there is no add head or add neck option. So you have to kind of think about how you want to control your head movement. So maybe if you're working with a dinosaur, you could actually use a spine, right? So if you add like a nice spine, you can use like FK control to maybe control how that head operates. But I'm just going to use FK bones. I just want some simple FK control for this little bit of neck and the head. So the way to go about doing that is by just adding regular bones to these hubs. So I have this neck hub selected. I'm going to click on Add Bone, and I'll place one right here. And this will be essentially our neck, or the start of our neck, right? So let's name that neck bone 1. I already did that because I called the hub neck. And I'm going to rotate this, and again, make sure you look at the pivot. Where is this neck bone going to be rotating from? Well, typically most of your spinal joints are like kind of towards the top part of the neck, so don't have this be centered. Maybe a little bit more high than you would typically put it, but make sure it's centered to the character, obviously, in front view. It should be. I'll make it a little bit longer and wider and taller, just so it's easier to grab. And I'm going to click on Add Bone again with this bone selected, and that'll place our second neck joint, which I can then make a little bit longer so that it maybe sits at the base of the head or skull. And maybe I'll add just a little rotation to this. Okay. And now we can actually just go right on ahead and add our head bone to this neck joint. So this will all be FK controlled, basically. So I'm going to click on Add Bone, and this will be our head joint. So head, very important. Make sure you place this pivot in the correct spot. So maybe over here somewhere. Okay. And I'll just make sure it's nice and deep so I have an easier time grabbing this. I'll make sure to name this. Call it head. Great. And now we can start thinking about all these auxiliary bones, right? So we have ears to worry about, we have jaws to worry about, we have a tongue to worry about already. I can add plenty more facial bones to this later, but those are the main ones I want to worry about. And again, the basic methodology stays the same. So for those of you that are wondering how to do that for facial bones right now, same exact thing. But again, I typically like to do them later. But I'm just going to have the head bone selected, click on Add Bone, and it places it over here because it kind of follows that same path. And this will be the jaw, let's say. So I'll call it jaw. And again, be very careful where you place this pivot. So think about where your character's jaw is going to be rotating from. Maybe right around here. Ish. Okay. And I'll just make this nice and thin because we're going to probably have to manually do some skinning here anyways. But I'll make it nice and thin so it's easier for me to select. I don't really have to go through customizing this bone too much. But this will be fairly easy to grab once I'm getting ready to animate. So this will control our jaw rotation, so opening and closing the mouth. And to this bone, I'm going to add some tongue joints. And I want to make sure they're actually lined up with the tongue geometry. So I'm just going to right-click, unfreeze all, choose the tongue, and also select this jawbone. And I'm going to right-click, isolate selection. Okay. So to this jawbone, I'm going to add a bone. Call it tongue, and I'm simply going to place that at the base of our tongue. Let's rotate it, like so, to make it way less long. Maybe I'll add like 3 bones to this tongue, just so I have a nice degree of motion in there. So I'll continue this bone chain, so I'll click Add Bone again, rotate this, and I'll click Add Bone one more time, rotate this to kind of match the tongue, and I'll add some extra length to it. So we have our tongue bones set up. Let's click End Isolate. I'm going to select the head bone again. We're going to do the same thing for our ears. So I'm going to select the head bone, Control select the ears, right click, Isolate Selection. Again, this is why it's so easy if you keep things separated for so long, or as long as possible. You have much more control, it's easier to see things. So I have the head selected. I'm going to click Add Bone. It'll place one that's way too big, and I'll just move that over to the start of the ear, which actually sits inside of the head a little bit, so I'm probably going to place the pivot right around here. Let's call it ear left to make this bone much smaller. Really, it's just about the pivot, but we do want our rig to kind of resemble the character that we're going to be animating. So again, really be conscious about your pivot locations. Make sure it's nice and central to the mesh. Make it a little less wide. And I'm going to continue down the chain. So probably need 1, 2, 3, probably 4 bones, let's say. So I'll add one more, rotate it. So, add another one, and always check the pivots, and maybe one last one, which I'll move down slightly, and that will just kind of be the tip of the ear for some follow through. You'll notice they're not physically connected. That's because I move it down, but they are still linked together. So at this point, because I want to mirror it over to the other side, I can select the first bone in the chain, hit Copy Bone Settings, select the head, click Add Bone, select the bone I added, and then click Paste Mirror Bone Settings. Definitely save before you do this. It likes to crash on you when you do that sometimes. And you'll see it mirrors it really nicely. You can now go ahead and name this side. So typically I like to just copy the preset from one side to the other. There we go. So just change the L's to R's. And then End Isolate. So at this point, we have our basic rig set up, which means we can actually start worrying about skinning. Now typically what I like to do is that you'll see that all of these cat bones are boxes. They're simple box geometry. So I like to actually display them as wireframe boxes. It's just easier to see what's going on. So the quickest way to make sure that that is the case is if you double click on the pelvis bone, it'll select all of the corresponding cat bones. If you right click, go to Object Properties, you'll see this menu. Now if you turn off renderable, for some reason all of these properties still stay in effect, so it won't actually render it. You don't want it to be rendered, I'm assuming, but it'll also still in the viewport cast shadows on top of your mesh, which is kind of annoying. So you want to make sure that you uncheck all of these before you uncheck renderable, otherwise these properties will still be on. Then you can click on Display as Box and hit OK. So if I go back into polygonal view, you'll see that these are now transparent and just wireframes. So I can click on all of my character meshes and hit Alt-X again so that I can see them. Like so. Nice. And now we're ready to start skinning essentially these elements. I know I said previously I wasn't going to skin the horns and the teeth, but since you'll see how I'm going to be linking these eyeballs to the bone and setting those up using essentially a LookAt constraint, I may as well just skin these, but I'll skin them separately for now so you know how you can essentially do the same thing as linking through skinning. And again, we'll be combining everything afterwards, but for now I'll be doing these separately. So what I like to do at this point is select the elements that I know belong to a specific bone and setting them up before I do the rest of the body. So I'll select the eyeballs and the horns, for example. I'll click Isolate Selection, and these eyeballs I'm just going to link to the head bone. So I'm going to select the eyeballs, grab the Select and Link tool, and drag from the eyeballs to the head bone. These are now parented. Then I can control click on the horns and the head bone, click Isolate Selection again, just a cleaner way of working. Make sure you hit W so you're not stuck in Select and Link. And I can select the horns, apply our first Skin Modifier, Skin, and I'm going to go to Bones, click on Add, and because we're in isolation view, the only cat object that should show up under the cat layer is the head. So I can click Select, and effectively this mesh is now skinned to that bone. Great. So that was simple. Now we can do the same thing for this lower gum and lower tooth section. So I'll select those two and the jawbone. And I may as well combine these as one object. So I'll just attach the teeth to the gums. They're separate materials, so that's why this message popped up, so I can click OK. Okay, so I'll call this maybe lower mouth. And I'll apply a Skin Modifier to that. Click on Bones, Add, and select the appropriate bone. Skinned. Perfect. Let's do the same thing for the upper teeth and gums. Select the head bone with those. Again, I'm just going to merge these. So attach. Okie dokie. So I'll call that upper mouth. Skinned. After I apply the Skin Modifier. Sorry, got a little bit ahead of myself there. So select the appropriate bone and isolate. So these guys are all set up. May just freeze these. Freeze selection. Don't have to worry about them. Great time to save. So let's do the tongue next. So I'm just going to double click on the jawbone, so it'll select that entire chain. Deselect the jawbone, so I'll drag over it. So I'm just left with the tongue bones. Select the tongue mesh and isolate selection. Same thing. Skin Modifier. And then add the appropriate bones. Should just be 3 of them. Click Select. So now if I rotate this, the tongue will be skinned to these bones. Obviously we didn't do any enveloping or skinning yet, so it might not look the greatest in terms of deformation, but we'll get to that. So I'll freeze that. Freeze selection. And let's do the ears real quick. So for those, I'm going to select the ear chains. So just control select those bones. And the head bone as well, because part of it is attached to the head. Make sure I have that whole selection. Yep, looks good. Isolate selection. Select the mesh, ears, and apply the skin modifier and choose the appropriate bones. So these are all pretty easy to figure out. So maybe I'll just grab these. I'm not going to skin anything else to this. And freeze selection and isolate. So those are all pretty easy to set up. Actually, I forgot about the tail. Let's do the tail because it's similar. So select the tail chain, select the mesh, isolate selection, grab the skin modifier, click on add bones, and grab the tail bones. Great. Select this again, freeze selection, and isolate. Cool. So those are all pretty obvious and simple to set up. Now we can worry about the body, right, and the head. Let's do the head first, actually. So I'm just going to select the main head bone because it's obviously going to be controlling part of the head. I'm also going to select this neck bone that's directly adjacent to it because part of it will be influencing the head, and then our jawbone, right? So those are the three bones that are mainly going to be affecting the head at this point. Right click, isolate selection. Looks like I forgot to select the head. There we go. Select your head mesh. Add the skin modifier. Add the bones. And those are set up. So I'm probably not going to be skinning anything to the jawbone anymore, maybe the head bone. So I'll freeze the head mesh and the jawbone. These two are still selectable. And now we have our main body to worry about. So we have this giant mesh that needs to be skinned to the appropriate bones. So things that you don't want to include are the foot platforms, this basic node, and like I said earlier, this top hub. Those I do not want to include in my skinning. So what I'm going to do is right click, hide selection. So I'm literally just left with all the bones that I do want to skin the body to and the body's mesh. And then I can just drag over all those, and just for good measure I'll isolate them. Right, and you'll see it's a good thing I did that because I had the tongue selected still. So deselect that and isolate selection again. And now I'm left with the body. And I can safely skin that to the current bones. So apply the skin modifier, add the bones, make sure you grab all of them. So just click on the first one, hold down shift and select the bottom one, and they'll all be highlighted, and then hit select. Great. Now if I end isolate and I unfreeze all and I unhide all, our character is effectively rigged. There's going to be some deformation issues, but for the most part, he's rigged. So if we move our bones around, our character should now move with them. Issues are obviously skinning, and we'll kind of start by addressing that before we move on. The best way, I think, personally, to approach sort of enveloping and skinning issues is by actually making a little bit of an animation to work with, which also gives us the opportunity to check out one of Cat's neat features, which is the automatically generated walk cycle. If you want to see something funny right after you set up your rig, do that. So if you go to your motion and control panel and you have one of your cat bones selected, you'll see the animation layer manager. If you add this little green guy here and hit the play button, you'll be confronted with something hilarious, which is this procedurally generated walk cycle, and it's terrifying. So let's get rid of that. Let's add an ABS, or an absolute animation layer, and make sure after you add the layer you actually hit this stop button. It should be in play mode. Play mode is when you're animating, and make sure you're on that when you start keying, because if you're not, you're actually ruining the bind pose. So again, make sure you're in play mode before you start keying your character's cat bones. Then I'm just going to scrub to frame 0. I have auto key on, so click this or hit N on your keyboard, and I'm just going to double click on the pelvis so all bones are selected. Now remember that we linked the eyes to the head bone, so you definitely want to deselect those when you're keying, because you don't want any keys on there. And I'm just going to select the foot controllers as well. And at frame 0, I'm going to right click on the scrubber and set a key for everything except for scale. You basically never want to scale a rig anyways unless it's set up to do so. And hit OK. So now we have a keyframe at frame 0. And I'll just scrub ahead in the timeline a little bit. And I'll just start posing one anatomical side. So we can mirror over a lot of our skinning information. So as long as we focus on one side, we don't necessarily have to worry about the other. I'm just going to select the major control bones for the cat rig, and you need to understand how they work and which bones you should actually be working with and which ones you shouldn't. So I'll make another video about how to add controllers to this, but when you look at chains, for example the arm chain, basically the first bone in each sort of twist bones chains are going to be the control bones for FK, right? So this upper bone here is going to be the one that, and look at the amazing enveloping. The first bone here is going to be what's controlling the overall arm rotation from a shoulder standpoint, and then the first bone in the elbow chain here is actually what's going to be controlling forearm rotation, right? These other bones, the second segment, if you will, aren't really going to be used to animate. They're just there for twist bone purposes. So I actually see that the elbow, by default, does a pretty good job. There's some minor issues there with some buckling, but nothing crazy. And because of the twist bones, more often than not, with your initial setup, you'll already have a very good forearm twist. So if I grab the palm bone and just rotate that, you'll see I get a really nice forearm twist by default. Looks pretty good. So I'll just rotate the hand down so we can kind of tweak the way the wrist works. It's a little rubbery right now. But let's rotate this arm up slightly. I'm just going to put him in a somewhat extreme pose so we can check the extremities, because more often than not, those areas are where things go wrong. So for the foot platform, I'm just going to move that out. You're basically never going to touch any of these bones in here. Again, I'll make a separate video showing you how you can create a swivel controller for the knee, so the knee will always be capable of being adjusted, but for now you're never basically going to touch these leg bones with the exception of the toe joint. Cool. So hips, move those down a little so we can see kind of the terrible deformation inside of the leg. I'm actually going to turn off my shadows. Makes it easier to see. And I'm going to add a little bit of rotation to the head bone, which actually is not too bad. And I'll try to open up that jaw, but you'll see the lip is probably going to freak out. And pull most of the face with it. All of these separate pieces, because we isolated them during skinning, will actually be pretty good. So we'll just have to do some minor envelope fixes to get those to work properly. And maybe I'll just add a little bit of rotation to this spine. Let's rotate the head up a little bit so we can see things a little bit better. So crazy pose, and our character looks like he's melting, but it'll help us in terms of visualizing what we need to fix on this guy. So I'm going to scrub back to frame 0. I'm going to click on the body here, and that's the main area of focus. I'm going to click on Edit Envelopes, and we're going to take a look at the major culprits. Now, whenever you're working with CAT, for the most part, the biggest areas where issues occur are along the spine. You can already kind of see that there are some problems. Basically, for the most part, other than the pelvis, your joints should be vertical. You can see that it made our belly horizontal, so it's actually pointing towards. The other issue is it tends to make the envelopes of these areas way too big. And the way envelopes work, fairly simple. So each of these gray lines corresponds to a bone, and they have 2 control points along a yellow line that controls the placement of this bone, aka essentially like altering the pivot point of the joint we created. And then it has this outer ring which controls fall off, and an inner ring which controls absolute power. Now, the biggest mistake people make whenever they're skinning a character is that they'll immediately start thinking about manually weighting verts, which is fine if you have a low poly character, but this character is fairly dense, right? This is more of a film character, especially the face. The body is fairly dense. It's got decent topology, but this would be a nightmare to manually weight. And for the most part, you really don't have to when you're working with envelopes. There's a lot you can achieve by just properly setting things up. So you want to make sure that you start off with the spine. Typically, if you go in and just make these outer fall-off rings much smaller so that they're not grabbing the arm and areas that they really shouldn't be, a lot of the issues that you're seeing will probably already kind of be minimized. I'll also move this joint up slightly. I'm going to make this joint vertical. So I'll just move these 2 points so that the envelope is vertical, and same thing, tweak the outer fall off. Okay. And let's take a look at this pelvis. So it's grabbing too much of the legs. So I'll just minimize the outer fall off, maybe move it up slightly. So it's grabbing a little bit less of the legs. It's grabbing a good chunk of the hindquarters. We want it to, but maybe not as much of the legs. So maybe I'll just move this up slightly as well. And now I'm going to work my way down to extremities. So maybe, and I can scrub to my animation as I do this. You'll see that just changing those things already greatly improved the way that this character is deforming, right? And I haven't even touched the arms or legs yet. So if I wanted to now, I could play around with the leg bones to maybe get a little bit more of a pleasing result. Move these envelopes around until I feel it looks good. And again, really teach yourself to stick in or stay in the envelope mode for as long as possible. Okay. Let's do this lower leg. I'll make the inner envelope a little bit bigger, and then I'll move it down so I get a nice crease there. And I'll do some tweaking over this upper leg bone as well. Main thing you want to keep in mind is that you can't really just typically fix stuff by messing around with one bone. You always are going to be at least messing around with two. Right, so don't get discouraged if you're tweaking this and you're not immediately seeing the result you're looking for. Typically, you're going to have to mess around with at least two bones for it to work. And also, keep in mind that you have to move these bones as well as mess around with the envelope's parameters. So it's not just one or the other, it's two things. So that's looking pretty good. Let's work our way down to the foot. So the envelope's way too big currently, and I'll make it a little bit harsher around the ankle and drop that down a little bit. And again, two bones, right? So maybe I'll just scrub back to keyframe 0, and I'll just kind of straighten this bone out a little bit so it's more in line with the anatomy here. It's a little bit tilted, and we'll scale that down drastically. That's looking much better. I'm kind of speeding through this because I don't want to spend too much time on this, because there's plenty of other stuff to show. But typically, this is how you should approach sort of skin weighting. And as long as you really teach yourself to, for the most part, work with envelopes as opposed to manual weighting, you'll get a very decent result relatively quickly. And obviously you'll get better at it the more that you do this. But for the most part, it's really not that hard. So here we're getting some interesting stuff. You'll see that we're getting some crunching, like having wireframe on definitely helps here. Typically, crunching occurs when the outer envelope is fairly close to an inner envelope. A little bit of fall off typically is not a bad thing. So what you can do if you need more control points, and I may need one over here, is if you go to the cross sections part of your skin modifier and click on add, you can click anywhere along the yellow line of an envelope and give yourself another lattice control point to work with. So if you need more or less fall off, this is a nice way to get some more control over a particular region. Cool. Let's take a look at these neck joints. So that one looks okay. That one looks okay as well. I may make the clavicle a little bit bigger, and typically I'll just use the fall off. It's kind of a subtle effect. Something like that. You really shouldn't have to mess with the shoulder too much. Maybe increase its outer envelope slightly. That already looks very good. The back here, tends to be kind of a problem area in general. You can kind of move the shoulder envelope forward a little bit so that it's not grabbing too much of that. And you can also increase the fall off of the back a little bit more. Okay, looks pretty good. And I'll show you later how you can manually deselect some verts just for cleanup purposes, but really it shouldn't be much. So let me just do this wrist. So again, there's 2 bones in there. So I'll just go back to frame 0 real quick. So it has a fairly harsh crease in your wrist as it folds down. So you can set these to local as well, just makes it a little bit easier to move them around. So you want to make sure you mimic that as much as you can. So this hand has way too much fall off, and you do want to retain a bit of it because you like that wrist twisting, but it shouldn't be an absurd amount. Scrub forward. You can see that really fixed things. Right, that looks quite nice. Maybe I'll just pull that down slightly, and I'll increase or decrease the outer fall off for the area around the fingers. So that the finger bones actually control the majority of the fingers themselves. Cool. So let's jump out of edit envelopes mode and take a look at this. So the body looks a heck of a lot better. If you look at that, that looks like pretty natural deformation. We can worry about the face afterwards. So kind of happy with the way the body looks. So I'll show you how to mirror. So if you go to edit envelopes, you go to mirror mode. What we want to do is, we didn't do any manual weighting yet, so we're simply going to identify the area that we want to copy over. So blue is what we did. We want to copy that over to green. So I'm going to look for the paste blue to green bone button and simply click on that. So now one side has been copied over to the other. Be careful when you do this. Sometimes it likes to rotate some of your joints. So definitely take a mental snapshot before you do this. Great. Let's go back to frame 0. Let's do the head. Let's actually isolate it with its corresponding bones. And let's take a look at that jaw. Alright, so right now, when the jaw moves down, a lot of the face comes with it. So this is where we're going to have to do some manual weighting. So I'll open up the envelopes, and I'll start off typically by still kind of adjusting any main culprits that I feel are maybe doing things they shouldn't be. So maybe I can just kind of tweak that to look a little bit better. Maybe the neck bone is grabbing too much. Alright, it's grabbing a little bit of the upper head here. Probably don't want that. And then we'll just kind of move this guy down. Okay, so manual weighting can be done 2 ways. You can paint, and you can do vertices. Typically, I'll start off by doing vertices. So at the very top of your Skin Modifier, there's a vertices checkbox. If I select some verts, let's say this upper face area, and I keep clicking on Grow, I now have a nice selection here. Obviously, I do not want these verts to move with the jaw. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the head bone, and I'm going to set the absolute effect for those vertices down here under weight properties to 1. These vertices are now weighted to the head bone. I'm going to select the jawbone and do the same thing for these verts. So select the lip, for example, keep hitting grow. Be careful to stop when you feel like you maybe grabbed too much. Do a little bit of manual selection here. Something like that. And again, we're only doing one side, we can mirror it over afterwards. And I'm going to parent these to the jawbone. So I've parented the face to the head bone, and the verts of the jawbone to the jawbone. So now if I play this, you can see the mouth is opening, right? Looks pretty okay. But you can also see I have some major crunching happening. I also have some areas that definitely should be parented to the head bone that aren't moving with it. So this is another way to now control your weights. If I click on off vertex selection mode and I scroll down, you'll see that there is this under weight properties weight painting tools. And by default, paint blend weights is checked. If you turn that off, the simplest way you can think about this is that you'll be painting at absolute power. Okay, so if I select the head bone and I click on paint weights, you'll see my tool is way too big, but I'm in paint weight mode. If I click on these 3 dots, I have the menu, so I can change my maximum size to be smaller, maybe something like that. And now I can just click on these vertices to kind of fix these areas so that they actually move with the appropriate bone. Something like that. Okay. And once you fix that, check paint blend weights, and you should think about this effectively as smoothing. So if I now click on these areas where crunching is happening, it'll essentially try to smooth them out for me. And typically, that's about all the weighting that I do on a high poly character. So fully weight to one bone, and then blend. And you have to blend for both bones, by the way. So select the jawbone and paint some blend weights in there for the best result. A little something like that. Great. Let's mirror this. So in this particular case, I'm not really mirroring bones because there's only one set and it's perfectly centered. I am just mirroring vertex data. So in this case, you're going to look for the button that says paste blue to green verts. Clicking on that will mirror your vertex information, leaving you with this. So now if we go out of this, our jawbone now functions. Right, we can add some nice rotation to it, close the mouth, and with cat you can even move these slightly. So you can see how that really gave us a pretty decent result. So we have this nice freedom now over how the jaw moves. Right, so really quickly, we've rigged a character using the basic bones with already some facial setup. Like if I open this, and I double click on the tongue joint, I can actually animate the inside of his mouth. Cool, right? So pretty simple. He looks very intelligent there. So pretty simple to set that up. So I'm going to close my skin modifier, go back to frame 0, and I love that I didn't key that, so it permanently ruined the face, but luckily it's an animation layer, so I should just be able to toss it, and we have our bind pose again. I just want to set up an eyeball controller for LookAt purposes, and then we'll talk about adding some more facial bones for maybe some brow control and the corners of the mouth. So typically for a LookAt controller, I'll use something like a dummy. So I'll go to my helper menu, standard, and grab a dummy object. Just draw one out on the floor. Call it LookAt. And I'll just Alt-A, align that to my character's head. It doesn't have to necessarily have the same rotation value as the head bone, so as long as it's kind of in the general path of the eyeballs, it will work just fine. And I'll place it about yay far from the character's head. There's two ways to go about this. You can either link this to your character's head bone, that way if you rotate your character's head, the eyeballs will follow. Or you can kind of leave it like an IK, where it's not linked to your character's head bone, allowing your character to actually focus on specific objects inside your scene. You can also dynamically do it using an animated link constraint, but again, that's something more for a different video. Let's set this up real quick. So I'm going to Control Select Ludo's eyeballs. They're both selected. I'm going to go up to the Animation tab, Constraints, LookAt Constraint, and you'll notice that when I have that selected, just like the Select and Link tool, it now has a dotted line. So if I go from the eyeballs to the dummy and click on the dummy, these eyeballs are now parented to this dummy object. You'll see it has viewport or view lines, but you'll also see, if I zoom in, it rotated the eyeballs in a completely different direction. I don't know why it does this, but it does. So select each eyeball and go to your motion panel, and you'll see that there are LookAt constraint properties, and you want to make sure you check keep initial offset for both of them. Okay. So what that does is, now if I move this dummy, the eyeballs will follow. And if you don't like these view lines, you can actually mess around with the setting in here as well. So view line length, if you turn that off, you won't have the distracting blue lines. You can just kind of see it happen. Cool. So already we have a nice degree of control over our character. Let's talk about adding some bones for maybe some brows, brow movement, and corners of the mouth. What I'm going to do is Control Select the head bone and our head mesh, and click on Isolate Selection. And I'm going to click on the head bone here. Make sure you're not in animation mode and that you don't have any animation layers. And go to the Modifier tab. I'm going to add a bone, and I'm going to simply call it brow left. And same thing as before, pay careful attention to your object's pivots. I'm just going to scale this bone down so it's nice and small, and maybe I'll place that like in the middle of his brow area, like over here or so. Right? Looks pretty good. Make sure, again, your pivot works nicely. It's half the work. So that'll be our brow bone. I'll copy these settings, click on my head bone, add another bone, select it, and click on Paste Mirrored. So now I have 2 brow bones. Select the head bone. Let's add one more. And that'll be maybe for the corners of the mouth. So maybe I'll just move this guy over. And when I say corners of the mouth, I meant like cheeks. So maybe something like that. Okay. And again, look at the pivot. Great. And I'll call that cheek left. Okay, copy. Select the head. Add a bone. Select it. Paste, mirror. Now remember, you have to do the same object properties trick for these guys. So right-click Object Properties, turn off all these parameters and renderable, and then set it to display as box. Nice. I can select my character's head and simply add more bones to my existing skin modifier. So they should show up here because we hadn't selected them previously. And if I hit select, they are now added to my character's skin box or modifier. So same thing as before. I'm going to add a quick absolute animation layer. Make sure you're in play mode. And I'm just going to key these guys at frame 0. And I'll just move them up. You'll see they'll already grab a little bit of my character's head. But you see here are where some of the issues occur. Why is that? It's because we already manually weighted those particular vertices to the overall head bone. So let's turn off auto key and let's click on our head. Click on Edit Envelopes and let's paint those appropriately. So let's select. Oh, 1 second, guys. I have a phone call coming. Not important. Probably telemarketer. So, click on Paint Weights. Let's make our brush a little bit smaller. A little bit more. And let's select the geometry we want this bone to affect. And right now I really animated this bone to go up way more than it should. Right, so it's going to kind of always drastically deform. Realistically, you probably would only move it, this particular bone, the cheekbone, about this much. We can go back in and just kind of paint some blend weights to even this out. And let's go out of the skin modifier. And obviously I didn't do a particularly good job right over here. Let's actually try to fix it. So paint weights without blend weights. Let's just grab a little bit extra and then try to blend. There you go. So now this bone will control sort of some minor cheek animation. You can rotate it. you can do whatever with it. Obviously, if you spend more time than I did working on the way that it's interacting with your already pre-existing skinning, it'll look better. And you can combine this with the float limit parameters that I outlined for the spline controls inside of my prior tutorial, so that you can restrict these to move only a certain amount on any given axis to give you a greater degree of control. But in a nutshell, that's basically how I do the majority of my character's rigging. So with a really simple rig, because honestly it really didn't take that much effort, we have a nice fair bit of control over how this character behaves with some decent deformation without too much of a hassle and too much manual skin painting, and we have some degree of facial control. Obviously, if you went the extra length and combined that with some facial morph stuff from the first tutorial, you can have some really cool, compelling characters relatively quickly. So there you have it. I hope that made your rigging life with Max a little bit easier, because Cat definitely is worth checking out. A lot easier than manually setting everything up yourself, and it's fairly quick to get a decent result. So good luck with this, and definitely let me know if you have any questions. It should be fairly self-explanatory, and I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. Thank you for watching. I apologize. I realized in all my excitement that I forgot to show you how to actually combine all this stuff into one skin modifier. So let's do that real quick. Very simple. So I'm just going to get rid of my animation layer. You don't really have to, but it is preferred. And I'm going to select all of my separate meshes, all the ones that were skinned separately. So that's pretty much everything with the exception of the eyeballs, right? Those are linked. Let's not forget the tail. And I'm going to hit Tools, Snapshot. I want to make sure it turns into a mesh. It should automatically select those. So if I hit Isolate Selection, effectively it duplicated all of those. Oh, those are wrong ones. And it added them to the cat layer. Yep. Make sure I select the proper ones. There we go. Sorry about that. In my sickness and confusion, I forgot. So I have these copies of my main mesh. What I'm going to do is simply attach them through the editable poly menu. Make sure it's an editable poly. So click Attach, effectively combining all of these. Okay. So effectively we have one Ludo character object at this point in time. And let's actually place that. Looks like I didn't attach the tongue. Let's actually place that in the character mesh layer. Okay. Great. And I'm just going to hide my cat layer. So I have my Ludo character mesh here. Let's hide these eyeballs so I don't accidentally click on them. So I'm going to select my Ludo character. And I'm going to use what's called skin wrap. And this was usually, or predominantly I should say, used to wrap high poly characters to low poly proxies that were rigged. But you can use it to combine different skin modifiers into one as well. So if I grab skin wrap and apply it to the character that we merged, It's very important that for your deformation engine you choose face deformation. If you don't, it's going to take much longer and Max will more than likely crash. So what I'm going to do is click on Add and then click on the underlying structures that I want to map this mesh to. So click once. You'll have to wait for this percentage in the bottom left corner to fill. So I did the body. Let's do the horns. Look at the percentage go up. The denser meshes are, the longer it'll take. Okay, horns are added. It shows up in the list. Let's do the teeth. And it'll take longer in general as it goes through because it has to remap each of them really quickly. The more structures you add. Let's do the tongue. So it's not just going through the tongue, it's going to go through each of these again after I add more and more objects to it. But it's still relatively quick, and most of it's done automatically. Don't freak out, sometimes it may look like it froze, but just give it a little while. You can always check here which ones you've already added. Let's add the upper mouth. So we should just have the head, ears, and tail left at this point. Okay, ears. Head. So this method really allows you, again, to keep things separated for as long as possible for a higher degree of control, and then only commit once you're happy with those individual pieces. So it's a highly effective way of approaching things, allows you to keep things nice and simple and clean, and not have to worry about optimizing until essentially the very last stage of your production. So it's adding the tail, should be done in a minute or two. Okay, when you're done, make sure to right click, otherwise you keep adding stuff. So this character is now already effectively skin wrapped to all of these individual meshes. So if I hide those from my scene, let's unhide the eyeballs, and I unhide my cat layer. If I move my cat, this mesh will move with it. Alright, so this mesh now is wrapped to the underlying mesh. To turn it into a skin modifier, couldn't be easier. There is a convert to skin button. If I click on that, it'll actually disable the skin wrap modifier and turn it into a skin modifier. So if I click on that, now it effectively turned into one skin modifier with all of these bones. They're all listed with one mesh that is being influenced. So this character is now fully rigged, and it still has all the properties from when we rigged all of these pieces separately. So really effective way to get your character set up done. So I really hope that helped. Sorry that I forgot about the most important part of the tutorial almost. I'm glad I realized in time. And I do hope that this speeds up your overall production, and that you'll kind of be a little bit less afraid about rigging. And my apologies that it took forever and a day to get this tutorial together. I've been really busy with a lot of things on a personal level and professional level. But it's here now, and I definitely hope that it proves to be useful. So again, thank you so much for watching, and please, if you do like the video, give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'll definitely be posting more tutorials in the near future. Probably one where, at the very least, I'm going to go over adding some custom controllers to this and setting up some limb properties for proper toe roll, because it actually is a little bit broken currently with the way it works inside of Cat, but it's a relatively easy fix. So you'll have that to look forward to. But yeah, thank you. Take care, guys.